Welcome. Today we are going to address Aristotle, whose understanding of ethics kind of advances that sort of shift that happens after Socrates. And really his notions of ethics, usually identified with the notions of virtue ethics, really becomes a hallmark of his philosophy. We're also going to kind of challenge some of Aristotle's idea with a more contemporary 19th century voice, that of Dostoevsky, and kind of see how this works in comparison with Dostoevsky's sort of critique as to Aristotle's notion of virtue ethics. Well, Plato becomes really the one who interprets and develops Socrates. Aristotle is usually seen as kind of that high mark for many philosophers, sometimes identified simply as the philosopher, or some would call him the philosopher's philosopher. And this is because Aristotle really brought in a lot of differing ideas. He lived from 384 to 322 BC. He grew up in Macedonia to a family of physicians in the court and would even later teach Alexander the Great. Interestingly enough, we have this sort of connection as Aristotle will learn from Plato at the school of Plato's. We have this idea from Socrates, who served in the Peloponnesian War, to Alexander the Great, and sort of this explosion both of thought and sort of military, political, social life that kind of runs as a stream between the four individuals here. What makes Aristotle different is that he believed philosophy was not just valuable in its practical services, not even for politics, to whom Aristotle prizes very high, but for its own sake. He too becomes a lover of wisdom, as Pythagoras was. And in many ways, he sees this idea of value in philosophy for advancing notions of virtue, that this becomes sort of the sake of philosophy on itself to aid in our understanding of that. And thus his great works include many on politics, as well as on logic, as he continues on those ideas, but ethics as well. Aristotle wrote profusely on many different topics, and this becomes part of his value. Now, Aristotle and Plato end up disagreeing, as many students and teachers do. Aristotle is not simply a continuation of Plato, and for many people, you're either an Aristotelian or a Platonist. Usually that debate becomes a little bit too abrupt, but that's part of it, right? They're almost antagonistic with each other. And the root of the debate was over ideas, over the relationship of an idea to the particular. Right? To go what we were addressing before with Plato, is there a realm of ideas, or is there and the realm of the material, and where do our understandings of the particulars come from in relation to the ideas? Aristotle says that we simply infer the nature of reality, or the realm of ideas, from particulars, that is, from things in themselves. So we understand the nature of something from our understanding of that thing, that there's not an idea that exists outside of that. There is no treeness, right? There's no idea that's going to have everything in and about it. Aristotle really kind of challenges Plato's idea here, saying that if we were to understand or believe that universal forms existed outside of sensible objects, then he's going to say we have an unnecessary duplication of ideas, that we have two worlds that interact but are almost just mirror copies of each other, one that's an idea and one that is material or physical or particular, depending on the arguments that you'd like to use. And so is it necessary, or is it the case? Right? To go back to our discussion before, is there treeness to something, or does it just we infer it and understand an idea of a tree from a particular of a tree? And logic really becomes an important argument here of relating the general, or the ideas, to the particulars, the phenomena, in our given perceptions. In other words, the substance possesses the attributes or the universals, right? And that relationship is different. You're not simply just accidentally having some of these characteristics, although that term is loaded, but you infer it as a result of that, right? So universals are in particular things only, which is contrary to that of Plato. So this is kind of the question for you, right? Do ideas exist on their own or just in particulars? Is there treeness or an idea of man, or is it just individuals, individual tree, and there's no idea beyond that? But in this famous image that you see here, the Renaissance painting, right? Plato's answer is there are things above, right? There is a realm of ideas, and you see him pointing his finger up. While Aristotle's hand is pointing down, right? And it's no, there's things below, that it's only this realm of where we're understanding. So this becomes kind of the debate between Plato and Aristotle. Now they'll disagree as far as a number of other things, as students and teachers ought to do, but this becomes this sort of debate and discussion on how we should see and shape the world. Later on, the legacy is debates over this same sort of idea as it's applied into medieval philosophy, beginning from a Platonic view and ending a little more Aristotelian, and then kind of going back to Plato and debating. And we still have discussions and arguments in philosophy departments as to where the realm of ideas are. Is there a realm of ideas in particulars, etc., etc.? So again, this is not a debate that was solved and over and a clear winner given. To understand Aristotle's discussion into politics, we have to ask a very simple question. What do you seek? What do you want? Well, that seems kind of open-ended and vague, but what is it you want? As you list a couple of things off in your head of what you would like, what do you need? What do you want? Do you want to be selfish, as Plato and notions of egoism from the Ring of Gyges before was addressing? Is that really just kind of the nature of who you are and how you relate to each other? Or do you seek other goods? And why do you want that? Right? Do you want wealth, comfort, food, pleasure, contentedness? Where is all that to be found? Is there a good reason to have wealth, comfort, food, pleasure, etc.? Is this what you're seeking after, and are they goods on themselves? Philosophically speaking, what we are wanting are called goods. This is the technical term for this discussion. So our attention is really onto what goods do we really seek? And are these goods done for their own sake or for something else's sake? Aristotle argues, surely that whose sake everything else is done is kind of the purpose of what we should be looking at. Therefore, if there is an end for all that we do, this will be the good achievable by action, right? We are going to do something for this. And if there are more than one, then these are be the goods that are achievable by action. Some things you always do for something else. There might be value in itself, but it's also largely done, and it gets its character from the end to which it is being subservient to. Aristotle gives the examples that in medicine, it is health. Right? We're going to study medicine so that way we can be healthy or help others to be healthy. In strategy, there is notions of victory. In architecture, a house or any other building that we would end up addressing, right? These are always done for something else. Now, that doesn't mean that medicine, strategy, or architecture don't have value in themselves, but they are good for something, not simply good for themselves. So Aristotle wants us to push a little bit farther. The argument, he says, has by a different course reached to the same point. But we must try to state this even more clearly. Since there are evidently more than one end, right? Architecture, medicine, or etc., etc. There's more than one end for all of these. We're not studying architecture to help people be healthy, although you could, or medicine to build houses. Again, who knows, maybe, right? There must be a chief good that is evidently something final. There must be something that even these are looking for. Therefore, if there is one final end, this will be what we are seeking. What we're really wanting is to find a final end, not a proximate end. This becomes the sort of discussion along those lines. So generally, I'm asking for volunteers. You can kind of say these things and these answers in your mind. Like, if I asked you, what did you have for lunch yesterday? Or why are you in this class? Or why did you pick out the shirt that you're wearing today? You'll have an answer to each of these. And in fact, all of you probably kind of either said in your head or out loud the answers to these particular questions. Now, why becomes a very natural and easy question. Why did you eat that for lunch? Why are you in this particular class? Why did you pick out that shirt particularly? The answer you give probably has another why. Whatever you said, I can challenge you again. What's the value in that? This is your schedule. Well, why didn't you pick a different schedule? Why is your schedule valuable? Why is that needed? Why that shirt instead of the one that was next to it? Why that food instead of another if it's not just because you're hungry or etc. and that was it, right? Why? And even for that question, we can ask another why, and likely another. And really the question we need to do is to try to find an answer to a why that there's nothing beyond it. That if somebody says why, you simply say because it's good in of itself. There's no other reason for that. This is the sort of end that we're seeking after. This is what we're trying to do, philosophically speaking, with Aristotle. So in the forum this week, go ahead and ask questions as to something, right? Find something that is a final end and not just a proximate end. Try answering, those questions as far as the shirt, the clothes, the class, or even something else. Why do you do something? And kind of start off with, here's an idea, and then say, is this approximate or a final end? And then what is the final end that is the end with that discussion, right? What is the reason, what is a reason that no one can ask you why again? Where you simply say because it is what it is, and that's what it is, sort of thing. And that has that sort of finality to it. Use the forum as an opportunity to both report to the rest of the class, like where you started and where you ended up, but also maybe even look at some of the other people's questions and push and challenge them to say whether or not their ends are final ends, or if they happen to be something else as well, and see if you'd agree with everyone as far as what they might say is a final end. Sometimes there's really clear and obvious things that we're like, okay, yeah, I get that. Other times somebody will believe something is a final end on itself, and you might not be so sure about it. Discussions are not always super clear, but for one person, something might seem to be a sufficient end. One class I had, they answered a chicken sandwich, and they thought that was a final end. Who knows? Right? So everyone looks at things a little bit differently, and I might want to challenge them some more. But everyone wants to look at things as to what they believe might be final ends in themselves. For Aristotle, the thing that is the end, he says, for such a thing is happiness above all else. This is to be held. For this we choose always for the self and never for the sake of something else. The term happiness is oftentimes also translated as flourishing. The Greek for this is not arete, that notion of personal flourishing, as we encountered before, but notions of eudaimonia. This is the happiness or flourishing for Aristotle. This is the good. He says that everything wants to be done is for this flourishing. It's very similar to that arete notion that we addressed before, but it is a different Greek word. He says, presumably, that is to say, happiness is a chief good might seem a platitude, and a clearer account, though, is what we still desired. But he's going to point out that it's not just happiness in a moment. Eudaimonia, we must always understand as something that happens in a complete life. You're not just doing something that's making you happy now, because something that makes you happy now might make your life horrible later on. It must be something that's going to make you happy in a complete life. And for instance, heroin makes a lot of people happy for a moment, but it's really not going to make your life good. Don't do heroin, right? This is a very clear and easy sort of statement, but yeah, you have a sense of euphoria and life seems great, but the rest of your life falls apart, and therefore it is not something that you dabble with and just kind of do for a moment, because it isn't going to make your life happy in a complete sort of sense. Aristotle says, "For one swallow does not make a summer, nor does one day. And so too one day or a short time does not make a man blessed and happy." So again, we're wanting to be happy in a complete life. This is why it's also seen as flourishing. Because again, what might make you happy in a moment might not be the same as you flourishing and thriving. Right? He says, therefore, one must be virtuous. We must have this tie of virtue within this. Otherwise, happiness is fleeting and not complete. Virtue will bring about the most happy life. So again, Aristotle starts this notion of ethics from a different sort of perspective. Right? We see very much in opposition to the idea of egoism, of I'm just going to get mine, where you're thinking of that as very short term and immediately getting something gratified. Aristotle's wanting to add in, like, if you want to really be selfish, you got to be virtuous, because otherwise your life isn't going to flourish. You're not going to be happy. So this is an interesting sort of debate back against Plato and the notions of the rings of Gyges, and as far as how we might see an ethical theory in moving forward. Now I know the question that comes up naturally next is, how can I be virtuous? Great question. Obvious question. One that you should probably be thinking about right now of, how am I to be virtuous? And again, this might also be a great thing to put in with discussion with your fellow classmates. Another question that might arise is, are there different kinds of virtue? Are there different sorts of things that you may be virtuous in, or different ways to achieve that? And Aristotle does move on and address this, although his answer is not always as clear to many, or doesn't make them feel quite as happy at the end of it. If we want to be virtuous, we need to understand what is virtue. And Aristotle wants to point out that there are two different kinds of virtue. There's intellectual and moral. Intellectual virtue, in the main, owes both its birth and its growth, he says, to teaching. Therefore, we already see another confrontation between Aristotle and his teacher Plato. He says reason is going to help experience and time showing these things, while moral virtue comes about as the result of habit. So you might be taught how to be intellectually virtuous in addition to some inborn ideas. But for moral virtue, it's going to be done through habit. From this, it is also plain that none of the moral virtues arise in us by nature. For nothing that exists by nature can form a habit contrary to its nature. Here he's going to say your natures are things that are entirely a part of your nature. They're inborn. They cannot change. Therefore, virtue cannot be of this kind because there are people who weren't virtuous who then become virtuous. We end up having a transformation, and therefore he's going to be disagreeing with some notions of Plato here. This then is the case with the virtues also. By doing the acts that we do in our transactions with other men, we become just or unjust. And by doing the acts that we do in the presence of danger and being habituated to feel fear or confidence, we become brave or cowardly. The same is true of appetites and feelings of anger. Some men become temperate and good-tempered, others self-indulgent and irascible, by behaving in one way or the other in the appropriate circumstances. Thus, in one word, states of character arise out of like activities. This is why the activities we exhibit must be of a certain kind. It is because the states of character correspond to the differences between these. You should notice the sort of similarity that we had to the discussion of the passions, or those innate desires, as we were addressing earlier with Plato and with Socrates as well, that right, you might have good ideas or bad ideas and where those come from, and all of this is the same sort of discussion. It all comes about from habits. Right? You do something, you create a routine, you get good rewards, and then that cue kind of goes over and again. Habits are extremely powerful. Breaking bad habits are very hard. Creating good habits are hard, but maintaining and living with a habit, be it of good or bad ill, is a lot easier than establishing and creating that. And the idea is that we need to establish and create a habit of virtue, and this is how we will end up being virtuous people. Still, how do we know if an action is virtuous or not? Aristotle ends up promoting what becomes the doctrine of the golden mean. That he says, first then, let us consider this, that it is the nature of such things to be destroyed by defect and excess, as we see in the case of strength and of health. Right? If you're deficient or excessive, then things get destroyed, be it on one end or the other. We must find the right point between what becomes known as these vices, and this is virtue. In exercise, we have to lift the right amount of weight, otherwise it doesn't do you any good. Right? If you normally are benching 150 pounds and I give you 300 pounds, you're not going to be able to lift it. You might hurt yourself a lot. But you're not going to be gaining strength. Similarly, if you're normally lifting that and I give you 10 pounds, you actually might hurt yourself again too by being completely reckless with just enough weight to maybe tear something if you're playing around and doing, 35 million reps or something stupid, right? If either side, you're not actually gaining and growing with your muscles. Right? It's not going to make you stronger, and in fact, it can do the wrong thing for you. The same sort of idea exists within every case. To be courageous means we're not being reckless and we're not being a coward, and that's what makes us courageous. That's what's going to make you happy. That's what's going to make you virtuous. Right? So this becomes the sort of goal and point that exists within all of these. And we have to find the right sort of action that's in between the vices that surround us on almost every sort of ethical dilemma. Many people have kind of put together an example of the virtues and how they're found between deficiency on one side and excess in the other. What it is to be brave or temperate or generous or truthful, and on and on. And you could find a million different examples, and you could probably think of quite a few as well. Now, again, it's understanding what is excess and what is deficiency. For some things, even a little bit of something is in excess. And for some things, you can have a lot of it before you're moving into excess, right? Where if you had only a little bit of it, it's deficiency. If a parent only loves their children a little bit, we're going to say that they're probably deficient in their love, right? That you need to do it a little bit more. Again, many different sorts of drugs, narcotics, a little bit, even a little bit of it is in excess, right? So it's not just a, easy sort of thing to do. You still have to use reason and intelligence and be knowledgeable about every sort of decision that you're going to weigh. And that's going to help you find what is the golden mean. So how can we ever become virtuous? The agent, the individual you, also must be in a certain condition when you do them, Aristotle points out. In the first place, you have to have knowledge, right? As we just highlighted a second ago. You need to know if a little bit of something is too much or not enough, because it's not the same across the board. Secondly, you must choose the acts and choose them for their own sakes. Right? When you do something, you have to understand the value of that on its own and not simply understand that it's going to have value because it does something for another's sake. Right? An action isn't virtuous because it'll lead to something more virtuous. Is it virtuous in itself? I mean, we can all decide to go rob a bank and give all the money to the needy who are desperately needing something. Does that mean robbing the bank is a good thing? No, because for its own sake, it's not. Right? That becomes the sort of our argument that he's making here. Thirdly, Aristotle argues that your actions must proceed from a firm and unchangeable character. Now, this is one that a lot of people will kind of push back against, understanding that you have to have knowledge about it and you must do it for its own sake. But Aristotle also says you need to understand that why you're doing what you're doing and not change in your character. Because if you're vacillating from one thing or another, then it's not an issue of virtue, it's just your fickle nature. And so you have to find the right balancing act within all of that. Actions, then, are just and temperate when they are such as the just or the temperate man would do them. But it is not the man who does these that is just and temperate, but the man who also does them as a just and temperate man does them. So this is a little confusing thing for a lot of people. For Aristotle, how do I know what's virtuous? Right, looking at everything else. Well, does a just and temperate, does a virtuous man do these? Yes. Okay. Are you doing it like they are and for the reasons they are? Yes. Then you're virtuous. If not, then maybe not. Maybe you're not being virtuous. That's not the way that it's going to work. So that makes life a little more confusing. Notice here that for virtue ethics, the school of ethics following Aristotle, what we need to choose is actions that are virtuous and choices that are going to be the best for our own lives. And the way you do this is just kind of fake it till you make it. Look at the other person who does this and follow their example and move forward. One of the greatest challengers to Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia is Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky lived from 1821 to 1881 in Russia. Now, Dostoevsky ends up looking quite a bit different for a lot of different reasons. His father was a doctor, like Aristotle's, so we have a similarity there. But while Aristotle, this was served in the court, for Dostoevsky, he lived on hospital grounds and saw sickness and disease that existed throughout all of 19th century Russian life. So it was definitely a different sort of perspective there. His family and himself were devout Orthodox Christians. Later on, he was sent to school in Moscow and to St. Petersburg. While his family was firmly middle class, this ended up putting him kind of on the outs of these schools because most of his classmates were aristocrats, and therefore he was the poor kid, even though he was better off than many others around him. While he was at school, because he was kind of on the outs with a lot of things, he ended up falling into a radical group of writers that were then arrested and sentenced to be killed. Right before he was to be shot, he was given a reprieve and instead sent to a work camp in Siberia. Now, this work camp is only slightly better than being executed, but you weren't being executed. And so it's very interesting to see this is one of those pivotal moments in Dostoevsky's life. And how would you respond with this moment as well? How do you think that a moment where you're certain you're going to die and there's nothing you can do about it, all of a sudden changes? You are inexplicably saved. Even if what you're being saved for sucks, a work camp, that's which is for some people almost even worse, you're not being executed. And this sort of experience kind of shapes most of his philosophy and his ideas moving through there. Upon his return, he would write a number of works. The Brothers Karamazov are probably, and Crime and Punishment are probably his more famous. But we have things like The Idiot and the Notes for the Underground and The Possessed as well. Dostoevsky's basic moral or philosophical teachings comes about through two different themes that you can find throughout all of his works. That is, first of all, that life is suffering. Right? Throughout his entire life, he sought and experienced this suffering. He saw the sick who were suffering. He felt persecuted and marginalized, and he suffered that way. He suffered in prison. He suffered in a work camp. He understands suffering. He lived a better life than many others, but it was still a life of suffering. And what Dostoevsky really wants to point out is that beauty can be found in suffering. That there can be some sort of beauty even in the moments of destruction and decay that is all around you. And so this is a very different notion than eudaimonia, right? Eudaimonia is about you flourishing and things going well. And here Dostoevsky wants to point out that even when things don't do well, there might be beauty still there. And so, again, you can think about how this is a challenge to Aristotle's ideas there. In Notes from the Underground, which is one of those works that he wrote after having this experience in prison, he says that we want happiness, which we'd all probably agree with, but we make ourselves miserable, that we love suffering. Now, I know this is kind of, you knee-jerk want to reject this idea, and many of you do, and then at the same time, many of you might go, you know what, there's some truth to that, right? How many of you are in relationships that are not good, but you're comfortable, that you like it, that the problems and the chaos are there? How many of you have some drama because everything else was too placid and nice? Right? Is it true that you make yourself miserable? That you don't truly want to be happy? That what we're really seeking is not just flourishing, but sometimes a little bit of misery? That you could possibly, in fact, love suffering? In the work, his character is addressing those who advocate for notions of modern progress, who believe that we need to reform humanity into something new and different. Here he's actually very explicitly criticizing the socialist and the communist ideal of the new, quote, perfect man. Against this philosophy of progress and improvement, he says that progress does not eliminate suffering. It only focuses on suffering and changes the focuses of different types of suffering. Here it's a very clear rejection of Marx and this idea. Dostoevsky argues that we may not be built to be perfect after all, and therefore this new perfect man that Marx and Marxists were arguing for is not something that's achievable. But the reason why he wants something, Dostoevsky argues, to go off on a tangent may be that he is predestined to make the road, and perhaps two, that however stupid the direct practical man may be, the thought sometimes will occur to him that the road almost always does lead somewhere, and that the destination it leads to is less important than the process of making it, and that the chief thing is to save the well-constructed child from despising engineering, and so giving way to the fatal idleness, which, as we all know, is the mother of all the vices. Man likes to make roads and to create. That is a fact beyond dispute. But why has he such a passionate love for destruction and chaos also? Notice here the idea is that sometimes the goal is not the end, but the journey, as we're going to see with some people like Ralph Waldo Emerson as well, another transcendentalist philosopher, fairly similar contemporary to Dostoevsky. But we also love chaos and destruction. It may not be, Dostoevsky continues, that he loves chaos and destruction. There can be no disputing that he does sometimes love it, because he is instinctively afraid of attaining his object and completing the edifice he is constructing. Does not man, Dostoevsky continues, perhaps love something besides well-being? Perhaps he is just as fond of suffering. Maybe you love to suffer as much as you love flourishing, and that you have these two different impulses within yourself. Perhaps suffering is just as great a benefit to you as well-being. Man is sometimes extraordinarily, passionately in love with suffering, and that is a fact, Dostoevsky argues. There is no need to appeal to a universal history to prove that. Only to ask yourself, are you a man? And have you lived it all? Like, this is almost sort of just out in your face, blatantly true for Dostoevsky, that we sometimes, not always, sometimes, love suffering. Do you think this is true? Do you occasionally love suffering? Dostoevsky argues, as far as my personal opinion is concerned, to care only for well-being seems to me positively ill-bred. Whether it is good or bad, it is something very pleasant to smash things. Right? Regardless of who you are, destroying things has some sort of value, even though it's not constructive, even though it's sort of, the opposite. Right? Is it pleasant to smash things, and why would that be? But what things also matter? Our decisions still matter greatly, even if it is in breaking things, that there's still value in your choosing to do what you do. And so, again, this is an interesting sort of critique of notions of eudaimonia and Aristotle, because he's adding in this whole sort of dark shadow as a perspective within all of that. In other works of Dostoevsky, we also learn a little bit further on his philosophy. In Crime and Punishment, we learn that we also do not know ourselves as well as we think that we do. We also know that even the worst among us within Crime and Punishment are not outside of God's love, and even they have some redeeming qualities, right? Even the worst person has something good about them, right? So it's not just everything's dour, but again, even in ugliness, even in suffering, there's some beauty, right? We have this sort of second sort of shot, right? There's always a silver lining to every cloud and a shadow to every beautiful thing, right? And we need to kind of learn from Crime and Punishment. How well do you know yourself? How well do you know who you are? Have you ever been in a situation where you thought you would act in one way, but you did the opposite? And did this surprise you? Right? I mean, many of us have gone through this countless times. If you haven't, congratulations. We'll see. In the work The Idiot, Dostoevsky tells about the clarity of near death, right? Very much coming from his own experience. He says that this has just huge value when you think you're going to die, that you become grateful for life, and that this gratitude and delight in life is so valuable. But everyone around you is going to look upon you just being happy for life and think you a fool, think you an idiot. And so this is where the character of this comes from. And maybe his other more famous work, The Brothers Karamazov, he says that we need to accept our own failings as part of our human condition as well, right? That we are not perfect, and we cannot think that we are to be perfect, that there is some failings within just the human condition. And yet this also means we still need to be redeemed, and that redemption is necessary for the human condition. Beauty is really an important idea for Dostoevsky. As we're going to encounter later with Sartre, there's a statement from Dostoevsky that he once wrote, "If God did not exist, everything would be permitted," or everything would be permissible, from another translation. For Dostoevsky, if God did not exist, then we enter into overwhelming despair, and ourselves, we would just simply be nothing. Right? So there needs to be, for Dostoevsky's philosophy, this other sort of guiding principle, this other God who is there. While the affairs in our life will distract us, this living life, a phrase that he uses, also adds up to nothing if there is no God. Further, if God is then our lives actually add up to something much greater than the sum total of all of our own experiences. Additionally, Dostoevsky is famous for his saying that beauty will save the world. And that this is, again, this idea that we need to have beauty. There's beauty even in despair, and this beauty is what saves us. Yet the world is also very clearly, for Dostoevsky, contaminated with sin, with fault, with failing. So beauty has to be something that comes outside of the world. It must have a moral, ethical, and spiritual dimension. And so for Dostoevsky, beauty is something that's linked to truth and to goodness. Specifically for Dostoevsky, this came down to his religious convictions as well. That beauty is found in this radiant image of Christ as celebrated through the transfiguration, of which you see an icon that Dostoevsky would have been very familiar with right there. Dostoevsky also helped to articulate a personal creed to help him maintain his sort of bearing within all of this. He writes, "I have constructed for myself a symbol of faith in which everything is clear and holy for me. The symbol is very clear. Here it is. To believe that there is nothing more beautiful, more profound, more sympathetic, more reasonable, more courageous, and more perfect than Christ. And not only is there nothing, but I tell myself with jealous love that there never could be." Right? There's this value in having this personal creed. For Dostoevsky, it very much has this religious dimension, but it helps him understand beauty and where this is and how it can relate with him. And having a guiding sort of principle within all of this is this idea of beauty and who it's found and personified with. Might want to think and maybe even share with others, do you have a personal creed? And what is it? And what sort of value might you have in constructing a personal creed? And would that help you to live a fulfilling life, even if you don't agree with all of the suffering part of Dostoevsky? If it's for that notion of eudaimonia, would a personal creed help you live a happy life as a complete life? Right? And modifying and clarifying your outlooks in life. Another creed that we'll encounter with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, another Russian, but of the next century, and we'll come across him at the end of the semester as well. He says that you can resolve to live your life with integrity, but let your credo be this: let the lie come into the world, let it even triumph, but not through me. Right? This becomes his sort of argument, that even if the world is going to be deceived, I'm going to have my integrity. That even if the lies are going to win, and for a lot of Solzhenitsyn's life, that's exactly what he was expecting, but it's not going to come about through him. even if he's going to suffer from that, to which he did in the gulags as well. So we have these sorts of notions of a creed giving value and hoping to clarify where you are and how you're supposed to understand your own life. So in conclusion, we addressed Aristotle and not only his continuation of Plato's work and his arguments against Plato, but also his development of notions of virtue as the aim of philosophy. Very much, though, against this, or kind of alongside, as we have Dostoevsky and his arguments. Which one do you think works better? Do you love suffering, or do you want to flourish? Or is life a little bit of a mix of both, right? Which one is there, right? Where is beauty to be found within this world? All of these are different ideas that are contemplated. And Dostoevsky really serves as a different sort of critique of Aristotle. Not one that rejects the idea, not one that rejects the basic ethical framework that you might have where you're wanting to flourish, but one that kind of recognizes the frailties of humanity instead of just the exaltation of those who might be, pinnacles of virtue sort of thing. So think about it, address, and discuss. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and let me know. I look forward to reading your discussions.